The silence in Robert Carson's study was heavy, pressing against the mahogany bookshelves like a physical weight, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the tall Victorian windows. He stood there, a man of 42 who commanded an empire of industry, yet felt utterly powerless within the walls of his own home, staring down at the cream-colored card stock in his trembling hand. The annual charity gala, black tie, +1 expected. The words mocked him, a cruel reminder of the void that had consumed his life for the past 3 years. Jennifer, his late wife, had thrived in these settings. She was the light that made the shadows of high society bearable. But she was gone, taken by a sudden, aggressive illness that had swept through their lives like a hurricane, leaving wreckage in its wake. All that remained were memories that felt like open wounds and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily, who possessed her mother's chocolate-brown eyes and a heart far too fragile for the grief she carried. Robert tossed the invitation onto his desk, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet room. For 3 years, he had attended these functions alone, enduring the pitying glances of colleagues and the whispered gossip of their wives. "Poor Robert," they would murmur behind their champagne flutes. "Still grieving, quite tragic, isn't it?" He couldn't bear another evening of being the object of their sympathetic entertainment. He wasn't ready for romance. His heart felt like a house boarded up against a coming storm, but he needed a shield. That was why he had listened to Margaret, his assistant. "A professional companion service, Mr. Carson," she had said, her voice dropping to a discreet whisper. "No romance, just a presence. Someone to stand beside you so the world stops asking why you are standing alone." It felt sordid, transactional, almost a betrayal of Jennifer's memory. Yet here he was, adjusting his silk bow tie in the mirror, waiting for a stranger to arrive. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6, a mournful sound that reverberated through the empty house. Panic flared in his chest. What if this woman was entirely unsuitable? What if she was garish or loud or, worst of all, tried to feign an intimacy that wasn't there? He was about to call the service to cancel when a small, excited voice drifted up from the entrance hall. "Daddy, someone is at the door." It was Lily. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. He had hoped to intercept the woman before Lily saw her, to spare his daughter the confusion of seeing a stranger on his arm. Cursing under his breath, he smoothed his dinner jacket and hurried out of the room, descending the sweeping staircase. The evening light was fading, casting long, stretching shadows across the marble floor of the foyer, turning the house into a monochrome painting of grays and blacks. And there, framed by the open, heavy oak door, stood the woman. She was not what he had expected. He had anticipated someone stiff, perhaps overly professional, or conversely, someone trying too hard to be glamorous. But Clare, that was the name on the file, was something else entirely. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with hair the color of spun gold falling in soft waves over the shoulders of a sleek black velvet gown. It was elegant, understated, and incredibly expensive-looking, but it was her stillness that caught him off guard. She wasn't fidgeting or checking her phone. She was standing on his doorstep staring at the interior of his house with an expression that looked disturbingly like recognition. Her eyes, a piercing shade of gray, darted from the chandelier to the painting on the far wall, a flicker of pain crossing her face before she composed herself. Robert reached the bottom of the stairs just as Lily, dressed in her favorite pink tulle frock, twirled towards the stranger. "Hello," Lily chirped, desperate for connection in their quiet, lonely world. "I'm Lily. Are you Daddy's friend?" Robert held his breath, stepping forward to intervene, but Clare had already crouched down. She didn't talk down to Lily. She met her at eye level, her movements fluid and graceful. "Hello, Lily," Clare said, her voice low and melodic, with a polished, received pronunciation accent that hinted at a well-educated background. "I am Clare, and might I say you look absolutely splendid. Is that the princess dress from the storybook about the magical garden?" Robert froze. That book, The Princess in the Garden, was an obscure, out-of-print book Jennifer had found in an antique shop years ago. It was Lily's favorite, but not something a stranger would know, let alone associate with a pink dress. Lily's eyes widened in wonder. "Yes, how did you know?" Claire's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a mask slipping before she recovered. "Oh, I must have guessed. It's a classic color for a princess." She stood up as Robert approached, her gaze locking onto his. Up close, the air around her seemed to change, charged with a tension he couldn't name. Mr. Carson, she said, extending a gloved hand. Thank you for having me. Robert, he corrected automatically, taking her hand. Her grip was firm, her skin cool even through the satin glove. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Miss. Morrison, is it? She nodded, but her eyes were still roving, taking in the details of the foyer, the vase of lilies on the console table, the specific way the rug was angled. It was unnerving. You have a beautiful home, she murmured, her voice laced with a melancholy that seemed out of place for a hired companion. The architecture. It's quite unique. The drawing room is to the left, I presume. Robert narrowed his eyes. Actually, the drawing room is to the right. The library is to the left. Clare blinked, a flush rising on her pale neck. Of course, my apologies, I must be disoriented. But Robert didn't buy it. The layout of this house was unconventional. Guests always assumed the drawing room was on the right because of the windows, but she had guessed left, which was where the library used to be before Jennifer renovated it 5 years ago. A cold prickle of suspicion danced down his spine. Who was this woman? Before he could interrogate her, Mrs. Walsh, their elderly housekeeper, bustled in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. There you are, my love, she cooed at Lily. Let's leave your father and his guests to their evening. We have popcorn to make. As Mrs. Walsh ushered a reluctant Lily away, the little girl turned back. Daddy, can Clare come say goodbye to my drawings first? Please. Robert began to refuse, anxious to get this stranger out of his sanctuary, but Clare spoke up. I would be delighted, Lily. She didn't wait for Robert's permission. She simply walked towards the corridor that led to the playroom. Robert followed, his suspicion deepening. As they entered the playroom, a chaotic explosion of colors and toys, Clare walked straight to the corner where the art easel stood. She didn't ask where it was, she just knew. Lily proudly displayed a drawing of 3 stick figures. This is Mummy in heaven, this is Daddy, and this is me, Lily explained. Clare stared at the drawing, and Robert saw her hand tremble violently at her side. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the stick figure of the mother, but she didn't touch it. It's beautiful, Lily, she whispered, her voice cracking. Your mummy, she must have loved you very much. Lily nodded vigorously. She did, she used to sing me the song about the moon. Clare closed her eyes, and for a terrifying moment, Robert thought she was going to cry. She began to hum a melody, soft, barely audible. It was Claire de Lune, the exact lullaby Jennifer used to hum to Lily every single night. The air left Robert's lungs. He stepped forward, grabbing Claire's arm, perhaps a bit too roughly. We need to leave, now. The drive to the hotel was suffocating. The rain lashed against the windows of the Rolls-Royce, sealing them in a private capsule of tension. Robert sat as far away from her as the leather seat would allow, studying her profile in the passing street lamps. You seem to know a lot about children, he said finally, his voice tight. And about my house. Clare kept her gaze fixed on the wet tarmac outside. I told you, Mr. Carson, I have a background in education, and big houses. They tend to follow similar patterns. It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. He leaned in closer, and that's when it hit him, the scent. It wasn't just a generic perfume. It was a complex, distinct blend of jasmine, sandalwood, and a hint of vanilla. It was custom-made. Jennifer had blended it herself at a perfumery in Grasse during their honeymoon. She was the only person who wore it. The bottle had been empty for 3 years. Your perfume, Robert demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What is it? Clare stiffened, her hand flying to her throat as if to protect herself. It's just something I picked up at a boutique. Is it offensive? I can try to wash it off. Robert stared at her, his mind racing with impossible theories. Is she a stalker? Did she know Jennifer, or was this some twisted game? No, he said, pulling back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. It's not offensive, it's familiar. The car pulled up to the curb of the Grand Hotel, the doorman stepping forward with an umbrella. As the door opened, letting in the chill night air, Clare turned to him. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a mask of perfect, professional composure. Shall we, Robert? She asked. But as she stepped out into the rain, Robert remained frozen for a second, a terrible thought taking root in his mind. He hadn't hired a companion for the evening. He had invited a ghost into his life. And he had a sinking feeling that she wasn't going to leave when the clock struck midnight. The grand ballroom of the Dorchester was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, vibrating with the low hum of expensive conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. Under normal circumstances, Robert would have navigated this shark tank with the practiced ease of a seasoned CEO, shaking hands and exchanging hollow pleasantries while his mind calculated quarterly projections. But tonight, his entire universe had contracted to the woman walking beside him. Claire moved through the crowded room not like a hired companion, but like royalty returning from exile. She didn't cling to his arm for reassurance. Her hand rested lightly, barely touching the fabric of his dinner jacket, yet he could feel the heat of her skin searing through the layers. As they passed the gauntlet of society photographers near the entrance, Robert instinctively tensed, bracing for the blinding flashbulbs that usually left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. But Claire didn't flinch. She tilted her head ever so slightly, catching the light perfectly, offering a smile that was both dazzling and impenetrable. It was a performance, Robert realized with a jolt of cold dread, a masterclass in deception. How could a primary school teacher possess the poise of a diplomat's wife? He watched her greet Lord Harrington, the chairman of the charity board, a man notorious for his frosty demeanor. "Lord Harrington," Claire said, her voice smooth as velvet. "It is a pleasure. I was reading about your foundation's work in the Telegraph just last week. The initiative in Sudan is truly commendable." Harrington, usually dismissive of plus ones, beamed. "Why, thank you, my dear. Not many take the time to read the details." Robert stared. The article she referenced had been buried in the business section, a tiny column. How did she know to quote that specific detail to that specific man? The evening wore on, and with every passing minute, the knot in Robert's stomach tightened until it felt like a physical obstruction. They were seated at the head table, a prime position that usually felt like a pillory to Robert. To his left sat Julian Thorne, his fiercest competitor in the tech sector, a man who had been trying to acquire Robert's company for years. Julian, a shark in a silk suit, leaned over, his eyes glinting with predatory amusement. "So, Robert, finally brought someone along." "I was beginning to think you married your work." He turned his gaze to Claire, stripping her down with his eyes. "And who might this be?" Before Robert could construct a defensive lie, Claire turned to Julian, her expression turning steely. "I'm Clare," she said, cutting off his inspection with a sharp look. "And you must be Mr. Thorne. Robert has mentioned you. I believe congratulations are in order for your recent merger, although." She paused, taking a sip of water. "One wonders if the regulatory body will look kindly on the redundancy clauses you've buried in the subsection of the agreement." Julian's smile vanished instantly. He went pale, his fork clattering against his china plate. That information was confidential. It was a rumor at best, whispered only in closed boardrooms. Robert froze, his wine glass halfway to his mouth. How on earth did she know about the redundancy clauses? He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a split second, the soft, empathetic woman from the hallway was gone. In her place sat someone calculating, sharp, and dangerous. She wasn't just a ghost, she was a weapon. "Dance with me," Robert demanded, not asking. He needed to get her away from the table before she dismantled his entire social circle. He led her onto the dance floor, his grip on her hand tighter than necessary. The string quartet began to play a waltz, slow, mournful, and achingly familiar. As he pulled her close, the scent of that custom jasmine and sandalwood perfume enveloped him, clouding his senses, dragging him back to memories he had locked away. "Who are you?" He hissed into her ear, abandoning all pretense of politeness. "You know about the book, you know the lullaby, you know about Julian's merger. Don't tell me you read it in a file. Who sent you? Was it Julian? Is this corporate espionage?" Claire looked up at him, her gray eyes wide and for the first time that night filled with something that looked like fear. Or was it sorrow? "Robert, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not a spy. I'm not trying to hurt you." "Then explain." He growled, spinning her away from a colliding couple. "Explain how you know things that only my dead wife knew. Explain why you smell like her." Claire bit her lip, looking away. "I can't," she breathed. "Not here, not yet. You wouldn't believe me." "Try me," he challenged. "Because right now I'm about to call security and have you removed." Claire stopped moving. In the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by swirling couples, she stood perfectly still and looked him dead in the eye. "If you send me away," she said, her voice dropping to a haunted whisper, "you will never find the key." Robert felt the blood drain from his face. The key. It was a metaphor he had used in his own mind earlier that evening, that his heart was a locked door and he'd lost the key. He had never spoken those words aloud to anyone. Not to his therapist, not to Margaret, not even to Lily. It was a thought, a silent, private thought. Before he could process the impossibility of what she had just said, Claire pulled away from him. "I need a moment," she choked out, turning and fleeing towards the ladies' cloakroom. Robert stood there, stunned, the music swirling around him like a fever dream. He couldn't let her go. He needed answers. He started to follow her, weaving through the dancers, but he was intercepted by Margaret, his assistant, who looked frantic. "Mr. Carson, thank goodness. I've been trying to signal you." Robert waved her off. "Not now, Margaret. It's urgent, sir," she insisted, grabbing his sleeve. "I just received a call from the security desk at your office. Someone accessed the secure archives remotely about an hour ago using your personal credentials." Robert stopped dead. "What?" "Yes, sir, they downloaded files, personal files, the medical records, Jennifer's medical records, and the trust fund details for Lily." The world tilted on its axis. Jennifer's medical records. Why would anyone want those? And then the realization hit him like a physical blow. Clare. She had been in his house. She had been alone in the hallway. Had she planted something? Or was she working with someone else? He looked towards the corridor where Clare had disappeared, but she wasn't going to the cloakroom. Through the gap in the crowd, he saw her slipping out through the terrace doors into the rainy night. He pushed past Margaret and sprinted towards the terrace. The cold air hit him, wet and biting. The terrace was empty, save for a few smokers huddling under the awning. He scanned the darkness and saw a silhouette at the far end near the stone balustrade. It was Clare. But she wasn't alone. She was speaking to a man, a tall figure in a trench coat, hidden in the shadows. Robert crept closer, hiding behind a large potted bay tree, his heart thumping against his ribs. Strained to hear their voices over the sound of the rain and the distant traffic. "He's starting to suspect," Clare was saying, her voice urgent, desperate. He noticed the perfume. It was too much too soon. The man laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Good, let him suspect. Confusion makes him vulnerable. We need him broken, Clare. We need him to trust you completely before the next phase." "I don't know if I can do this," Clare pleaded. "Lily, she's so sweet, and Robert, he's suffering." "This feels cruel." The man stepped forward, and the light from the ballroom spilled onto his face. Robert stifled a gasp. It was his own brother-in-law, Jennifer's estranged brother, David, the man who had been cut out of the will for his gambling debts. David grabbed Clare's arm roughly. "You'll do it because you have no choice. Remember what's at stake. You finish the job, or I expose who you really are, and then you'll lose everything just like I did." Robert's mind was reeling. A con. It was a sophisticated, twisted con orchestrated by his vindictive brother-in-law. Clare wasn't a ghost. She was an actress, a pawn in a game to get access to the Carson fortune. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through him. He was about to step out and confront them, to end this charade with violence if necessary, when his mobile phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. Reluctantly, he pulled it out, keeping his eyes on the conspiring pair. It was Mrs. Walsh. He hit answer, his voice low and dangerous. "What?" "Mr. Carson," Mrs. Walsh was screaming, her voice shrill with terror. "You need to come home immediately." "Calm down, Mrs. Walsh. What is it?" "It's Lily. She's gone. Her bed is empty. The window is open." "Oh God, Mr. Carson, there's a ladder outside. Someone has taken her." The phone slipped from Robert's numb fingers and shattered on the wet pavement. The sound of the cracking glass echoed like a gunshot. At the noise, Clare and David whipped around. David cursed and vaulted over the railing, disappearing into the dark gardens below. Clare stood frozen, staring at Robert with wide, terrified eyes. But Robert didn't see a woman anymore. He saw a monster. He lunged at her, grabbing her by the shoulders, pinning her against the wet stone balustrade. "Where is she?" He screamed, his voice raw with panic. "What have you done with my daughter?" The rain on the terrace had turned torrential, a deluge that soaked them to the bone in seconds, masking the tears streaming down Clare's face as Robert pinned her against the cold stone balustrade. Her expensive gown was ruined, plastered to her skin, but she didn't seem to care. She was gasping for air, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. "I don't know," she screamed, her voice cracking over the roar of the wind. "I swear to God, Robert, the kidnapping. That wasn't part of the plan." It was never supposed to go this far. Robert's hands tightened on her shoulders, shaking her violently. "What plan? Tell me everything, or I will kill you right here." The veneer of the civilized CEO had completely shattered. In his place stood a father pushed to the brink of madness. Clare sobbed, her body sagging in his grip. "David, he has gambling debts. Massive ones. He owes money to dangerous people in the East End. He hired me. I'm an actress, Robert, a failed one. He paid off my loans and promised me more if I could get close to you." Robert felt bile rise in his throat. To do what? To get the access codes, she choked out. The biometric key for the Carson Holdings mainframe. He thinks Jennifer hid a secondary inheritance fund in the encrypted servers. He wanted me to make you vulnerable, to make you trust me enough to let your guard down so he could swipe the key. That's all it was supposed to be. Corporate theft. He swore he wouldn't hurt anyone. Robert released her with a shove of disgust, and she slumped against the wet stone. You helped him, he spat, his voice trembling with rage. You used my dead wife's memories to violate my home. The perfume, the song. The diaries, Claire whispered, looking up at him, the rain plastering her blonde hair to her skull. He gave me her journals. Jennifer kept journals, Robert, detailed ones. She wrote about everything. The lullaby, the perfume she mixed in grass, the layout of the house, her fears about leaving you and Lily alone. I studied them for 3 months. I memorized her life. I felt like I knew her. She reached out a trembling hand towards him, but he recoiled. I didn't mean to fall for the little girl, Robert. That part wasn't acting. I love Lily. When I saw her tonight, I tried to back out. You saw me arguing with David. I told him I couldn't do it. He must have panicked. He must have realized I was going to fail, so he took her as leverage. A sudden, piercing ringtone cut through the storm. Robert froze. It was his mobile, lying in a puddle of water where he had dropped it, cracked but still functioning. He scrambled for it, his wet fingers fumbling over the screen. Unknown number. He answered, putting it on speaker, his hand shielding the microphone from the wind. David, he growled, a sound so guttural it barely sounded human. If you have touched a hair on her head. Save the threats, Robbie. David's voice came through, distorted and crackling but dripping with malice. You were taking too long with the girl. I needed to accelerate the timeline. I have Lily. She's safe for now. She thinks we're playing a game of hide-and-seek, but she's getting tired and my patience is thinner than she is. Robert felt the world spin. What do you want? You know what I want, the biometric key, the hard drive from your safe. Bring it to the old textile factory in Bermondsey. One Dad used to own before you bought the company and kicked me out. Come alone. You have 45 minutes. If I see police or if you try anything clever, the game ends. And Robert, bring the actress. She has loose ends to tie up. The line went dead. Robert stood there for a second, paralyzed by the horror of it. Then adrenaline surged. He grabbed Claire by the wrist, dragging her towards the exit. You're coming with me. Robert, please, she cried, stumbling in her heels. He'll kill us both. You better hope not, he snarled, pulling her through the stunned crowd of gala guests who parted like the Red Sea before his fury. Because if anything happens to my daughter, you won't live long enough to regret it. The drive to Bermondsey was a blur of speed and terror. Robert drove his Rolls-Royce like a getaway vehicle, swerving through the rainy London streets, jumping red lights, the engine roaring in protest. Beside him, Claire sat shivering, clutching the dashboard. There's a gun, Robert said, his eyes fixed on the wet tarmac. In the glove compartment. Get it. Claire froze. What? Get it, he shouted. She opened the compartment with shaking hands and pulled out a heavy black pistol. I don't know how to use this, she stammered. You don't need to use it, Robert said coldly. I do. He snatched the weapon from her and tucked it into the waistband of his trousers. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely a whisper. In the journal, the last entry, she wrote about you. Robert didn't look at her, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Shut up. She wrote that she was afraid you would lock your heart away, Claire continued, tears spilling down her cheeks again. She wrote, Robert tries to be strong for everyone, but he forgets that a fortress is also a prison. I hope he finds someone who can climb the walls. That's why I agreed to this vile plan, Robert. At first, I just needed the money, but when I read her words, I thought maybe I could be that person. I thought I could help you. It was twisted, I know. But I wanted to be the woman she described. Robert slammed on the brakes as a black cab cut him off, the car skidding on the slick road before straightening out. You are nothing like her, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Jennifer was honest. You are a lie wrapped in a pretty dress. They arrived at the abandoned textile factory just as the clock struck midnight. The area was desolate, a graveyard of industrial ambition. The factory loomed against the dark sky, a skeletal structure of broken windows and crumbling brickwork. Robert killed the headlights and turned to Claire. Stay in the car. No, she said, her voice finding a sudden, unexpected strength. He asked for me. If I don't go in, he might hurt her. And besides, I need to fix this. Robert looked at her, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was grim determination. Stay behind me, he commanded. They exited the car into the relentless rain, moving silently towards the rusted side entrance. The heavy metal door was ajar, creaking rhythmically in the wind. Inside, the factory was a cavern of shadows, smelling of damp rot and old oil. High above, on a metal gantry, a single industrial work light buzzed, casting a sickly yellow pool of illumination on the concrete floor below. And there, in the center of the light, sat Lily. She was tied to a wooden chair, a piece of duct tape over her mouth, her eyes wide and terrified. Standing behind her, holding a remote detonator in one hand and a petrol can in the other, was David. "Right on time," David called out, his voice echoing off the metal walls. He looked unhinged, his eyes bloodshot, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor. He poured a circle of petrol around Lily's chair. "Did you bring it?" Robert stepped into the light, holding up a small, silver hard drive. "It's here, David. The key, the accounts, everything. Just let her go." David laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Toss it here, slowly." Robert slid the drive across the concrete floor. It skittered to a halt at David's feet. David kicked it aside without looking at it. "You really are predictable, Robert. Did you honestly think this was just about money?" He looked at Clare, who was hovering in the shadows behind Robert. "Come out, Clare, join the party." Clare stepped forward, her hands raised. "David, stop this. You have the drive. Let the girl go." David sneered. "The drive is a bonus, but the real prize. The real prize is watching the great Robert Carson lose everything, just like I did when you cut me off." He clicked the safety off the lighter in his hand. "You see, Robert, I blamed you for Jennifer's death. You had the best doctors, the best money, and you still couldn't save her. So now I'm going to balance the scales." "No," Robert lunged forward, but David flicked the lighter. A wall of flame whooshed up instantly, igniting the circle of petrol around Lily. Lily screamed behind the tape, shrinking back as the heat intensified. "Don't move," David shouted, holding the detonator up. "I have rigged this whole floor with explosives. One step closer and we all go up." Robert froze, the heat of the fire searing his face. He was helpless. He couldn't reach Lily through the flames, and he couldn't shoot David without risking the detonator falling. "What do you want?" Robert begged, falling to his knees. "Take me, let her go and take me." David smiled, a cruel, twisted expression. "That's a tempting offer, but I think I prefer this." He turned to look at the fire, distracted for a split second by the flames. In that moment, Clare moved. She didn't run towards David. She didn't run towards Robert. She ran straight at the fire. With a scream of pure adrenaline, she threw herself through the wall of flames, her velvet dress catching fire as she crashed into Lily's chair, knocking it over and shielding the child's body with her own. "Clare!" Robert screamed. The distraction was enough. As David turned in shock, Robert raised the gun and fired. The shot echoed like thunder. The bullet struck David in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped the detonator and it skittered away into the darkness. David fell, clutching his shoulder, howling in pain. Robert didn't hesitate. He sprinted towards the fire, tearing off his jacket. He leaped through the gap in the flames where Clare had broken the circle, smothering the fire on Clare's dress with his jacket. He frantically ripped the tape from Lily's mouth. "Daddy!" she wailed, clinging to him. He pulled her free from the ropes, checking her quickly. She was singed but unhurt. But Clare lay on the concrete, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Her back and arms were badly burned. The fabric of her dress melted onto her skin. Robert gathered both of them into his arms, dragging them away from the fire and the petrol fumes towards the cool air of the entrance. He laid Clare down on the wet pavement outside, rain sizzling against her burns. "Clare!" He tapped her cheek. "Clare, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, gray and hazy with pain. She looked at Lily, who was crying into Robert's chest. Is she okay?" Clare whispered. "She's safe," Robert said, his voice breaking. "You saved her." Clare managed a weak, pained smile. "The key," she murmured, her eyes drifting shut. "I found the key." Then her head lolled back and she went limp. Sirens began to wail in the distance, getting closer, but Robert couldn't hear them. All he could see was the woman who had lied her way into his life, now potentially dying to save the only thing that mattered to him. And in the distance, from the shadows of the factory, a laughter echoed. David wasn't unconscious. He was gone. The accident and emergency waiting room at Guy's hospital was a purgatory of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. Robert sat on a hard plastic chair, a gray wool blanket draped over his shoulders, clutching a sleeping Lily to his chest. Her small hand was fisted tightly into his ruined shirt, her breathing the only sound tethering him to sanity. Outside, the London rain continued to hammer against the glass, washing away the soot and blood of the night, but it couldn't wash away the image of Clare diving into the fire. The doctors had taken her into surgery immediately. Degree burns on her back and arms, smoke inhalation, and potential spinal damage from the impact. Detective Inspector Evans, a weary-looking man with a notepad, had already taken Robert's statement. The police had swarmed the textile factory in Bermondsey, but they had found only scorched concrete and the blood trail of a man who didn't want to be found. David was gone. He had vanished into the labyrinth of the city like a rat into a sewer. It was 3 in the morning when the surgeon finally emerged. "She's stable," he told Robert, rubbing his eyes. "The burns are severe and the scarring will be permanent, but she will live. She's awake, Mr. Carson. She's asking for you, and there are officers waiting to formally arrest her as soon as we clear it. She is, after all, an accomplice to kidnapping." Robert nodded, his face a mask of exhaustion. He handed Lily carefully to Mrs. Walsh, who had arrived in a taxi, weeping with relief. "Take her home, Mrs. Walsh. Lock the doors. Activate the perimeter alarm. Do not open the gate for anyone but me." He watched them leave, then turned and walked down the sterile corridor to room 304. Clare lay in the hospital bed, wrapped in bandages connected to a symphony of beeping machines. Her blonde hair was singed, her face pale and bruised, but her gray eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. When Robert entered, she didn't look at him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a rasping shadow of the elegant tone she had used at the gala. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to know." Robert pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He didn't take her hand. He couldn't. The betrayal was still too fresh, a jagged wound sitting right next to the gratitude he felt for his daughter's life. "Why?" he asked simply. "You could have run. When David started the fire, you could have run." Clare turned her head slowly, wincing at the pain. "Because of the lie," she said. "The journal entry I told you about, the one about the fortress and the key." Robert stiffened. "What about it?" "Jennifer never wrote that," Clare admitted, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I made it up. I wrote it in my head while watching you with Lily. I saw a man who was drowning in grief, and I thought, if I could make him believe his wife wanted him to move on, maybe he would. It was a manipulation, Robert, the cruelest kind. But in the end, I realized I couldn't be the one to unlock the door if I was the one holding the match." Robert sat in silence, processing the layers of deception. She had fictionalized his dead wife's blessing to get close to him. It was monstrous. And yet she had thrown herself into an inferno for his child. "You saved her," Robert said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "That is the only reason I have convinced the inspector to delay your booking. I've hired a solicitor for you, a good one. You'll serve time, Clare. I can't stop that, but I will make sure the court knows what you did tonight." Clare closed her eyes, relief washing over her features. "Thank you," she breathed. "Robert, there is something else, something David said to me before you arrived at the factory." Robert leaned in, his instincts sharpening. "What?" "He said the plan was foolproof because he had a failsafe. He said, even if I lose the girl, I win the war." "He wasn't looking at the hard drive when you threw it, Robert. He didn't care about the drive." Robert frowned. "He asked for the drive. That was the ransom." "No," Clare whispered urgently, gripping the bedsheet. "He was stalling. He needed you out of the house. He needed you at the factory." A cold dread, colder than the rain outside, settled in Robert's stomach. He needed you out of the house. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "The breach," he muttered. "Margaret called me at the gala. She said there was a remote breach of the servers." "Margaret?" Clare asked. "Your assistant, the one who recommended the companion service." The pieces slammed together in Robert's mind with the force of a train wreck. Margaret had suggested the service. Margaret had vetted Clare's fake agency. Margaret had called him to the balcony, separating him from the crowd so David could snatch Lily. And Margaret knew the security codes to the house. "I have to go," Robert said, turning for the door. "Robert, wait," Clare called out, struggling to sit up. "Don't go alone, he might be there." But Robert was already running. He drove the Rolls-Royce back to his estate at breakneck speed, ignoring the speed cameras, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He dialed Mrs. Walsh. No answer. He dialed the landline. No answer. He pulled up to the heavy iron gates of his home. They were wide open. The security lights, usually blazing, were dead. The house stood in darkness, a looming silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Robert pulled the gun he had taken from Clare, which he had never handed over to the police, from the glove box. He exited the car, moving silently up the driveway, the gravel crunching softly under his dress shoes. The front door was ajar. He pushed it open with the barrel of the gun, stepping into the foyer where, only hours ago, Clare had stood in her pink dress. "Mrs. Walsh!" he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "Lily." He found Mrs. Walsh in the kitchen, slumped over the island, a jagged cut on her forehead. Unconscious but breathing, he checked her pulse, steady. She had been struck down. Panic, white-hot and blinding, seized him. He sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time towards Lily's bedroom. The door was closed. He kicked it open, gun raised. The room was empty. The bed was made. But on the pillow, pinned with a knife, was a note. Robert walked over to it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely read the handwriting. It wasn't David's scrawl. It was elegant, precise script. Margaret's script. "The hard drive was encrypted, Robert. We knew you. Never give us the real key. But David was right. We didn't need the drive. We needed the leverage. You have 24 hours to transfer the entire Carson Holdings liquid assets to the offshore account listed below. If you call the police, if you delay, if you try to find us, well, let's just say Lily has a new nanny now, and I'm not as nice as Clare." Robert dropped the note, a primal scream tearing from his throat. He spun around, intending to run, to hunt, to burn the city down if he had to. But as he turned, he saw a shadow in the doorway of the bedroom. A figure stepped out from the darkness of the hallway. It was David, his arm in a bloody sling, his face pale and sweating, holding a silenced pistol pointed directly at Robert's chest. "Hello, Robbie," David smiled, his teeth stained with blood. "You really should have checked the backseat of your car before you drove home. I've been with you the whole ride." Robert froze. He had led the monster right back to his sanctuary. "Drop the gun," David commanded. Robert hesitated. "I said drop it." David fired a warning shot into the floorboards near Robert's feet. Robert slowly lowered his weapon and let it clatter to the floor. David kicked it away. "Margaret has the girl," David rasped, stepping closer, the madness in his eyes shining bright. "She's already en route to a private airfield, and you and we're going to have a little chat about family finances." David raised the gun to Robert's forehead. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed like a thunderclap in the silent room. "Make yourself comfortable, Robert," David whispered. "It's going to be a long night." The screen fades to black as the sound of a single gunshot rings out.